One worker, one shout, and one finger that stopped the world. When an auto worker at Ford's Michigan plant called the president a pedophile protector, he didn't get a polite wave. He got the double F-bomb and a middle finger in return. The White House calls it an appropriate response, but the internet is calling it a political explosion. Is this the new standard for the presidency, or just another Tuesday in 2026? The Ford River Rouge complex isn't just a factory. It is a sprawling, soot-stained monument to the American century. Located in Dearborn, Michigan, it's a place where raw iron ore enters one end and a shiny F-150 Lightning rolls out the other. On this particular Tuesday, the air was thick with more than just the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. It was heavy with the electric tension of a high-stakes presidential visit. Security was airtight. Secret Service snipers were perched atop the industrial silos, their silhouettes sharp against the gray Michigan sky. Below them, thousands of workers were undergoing the surreal experience of having their lunchboxes scanned by K-9 units. For the men and women who build the world's most popular truck, the day felt less like a shift and more like a stage production. Inside the belly of the plant, the blue oval pride was on full display. Huge American flags hung from the rafters, dwarfing the massive robotic arms that hissed and popped with pneumatic precision. The White House had chosen this spot specifically to project a message of America First manufacturing, intending to use the backdrop of heavy machinery to underscore a new policy on trade and labor. However, the mood on the floor was far from unanimous. While many workers wore MAGA hats tucked under their welding masks, others stood with arms crossed, their UAW shirts a silent protest against the administration's stance on electric vehicle mandates. The factory was a microcosm of a divided nation, a tinderbox of competing loyalties waiting for a single spark. As the press pool began to assemble their tripods and the lighting kits were fired up, the hum of the factory shifted. It wasn't the sound of machines anymore, it was the low-frequency vibration of a motorcade approaching. The leader of the free world was about to step onto the shop floor, and the River Rouge was ready to roar. When the armored limousine known as the Beast pulled onto the concrete apron of the plant, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The doors opened, and Donald Trump stepped out, his signature long red tie contrasting sharply against the industrial blues and grays of the factory. He didn't just walk into the room, he claimed it, waving to the cheering sections with a practiced, cinematic flair. Flanking the president was a phalanx of executives. Bill Ford Jr. and CEO Jim Farley looked both proud and nervous, walking the tightrope between corporate neutrality and political necessity. They began the tour, leading the president toward the assembly line where the chassis of the new trucks were being married to their engines, a process the workers call the wedding. Trump seemed to be in high spirits, pausing to admire the sheer scale of the operation. He leaned over the railings to point at the spark-showering robots, shouting questions to Farley about production numbers and steel sourcing. To the cameras, it was the perfect image, a billionaire populist at home among the gears of industry, a man who spoke the language of the forgotten man. But as the group moved toward the elevated catwalks that crisscrossed the plant, the cheering began to mingle with something else. It started as a low-level grumble from the back of the line, a few boos that were quickly drowned out by USA chants. Yet, there was a specific energy coming from the trim and chassis section, a group of workers who felt the president's presence was more of a campaign stunt than a policy visit. One man in particular, Thomas T.J. Sabula, stood near a hydraulic lift. He wasn't cheering, and he wasn't chanting. He was watching the president's every move with a cold, focused intensity. In his pocket was a printed list of grievances, but he knew he wouldn't get a chance to hand it over. He decided, in that moment, that if he couldn't be heard through a letter, he would be heard through the air. T.J. Sabula was not your average disruptor. A 15-year veteran of the Ford plant, he was known as a man who kept his head down and his production numbers up. But like many in the Detroit suburbs, he had become obsessed with the lack of transparency regarding the Jeffrey Epstein files, a topic he viewed as a litmus test for government corruption. To him, the president's visit was an opportunity to demand answers on a grand stage. As the presidential party ascended the metal stairs to a platform overlooking the main line, the noise of the factory seemed to drop for a split second. It was the lull that happens when one belt stops to let another take over. Sabula saw his window. He cupped his hands around his mouth, took a deep breath of the metallic air, and let out a roar that bypassed the Secret Service's perimeter. "Release the files, Trump. Pedophile protector, he screamed, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. The words were a jagged blade through the carefully curated silence of the VIP group. The press corps immediately swung their boom mics toward the sound, and the Secret Service agents on the floor began moving toward Sabula's position with practiced, terrifying speed. The executives froze. Bill Ford Jr. looked down at the floor as if searching for a way to make the moment disappear. The president, however, did not look away. He stopped dead in his tracks, his hands still resting on the yellow safety railing. The man who had faced down thousands of protesters at rallies found himself being challenged by a single worker in the very heart of his base. Sabula didn't stop. He repeated the chant, his face turning a deep shade of red, pointing his finger at the president. He knew the consequences. He knew he was likely throwing away a decade of seniority, but the adrenaline of the moment had taken over. He was no longer just a factory worker. He was a self-appointed messenger of the people's frustration. Donald Trump's reaction was not that of a typical politician. A traditional leader might have ignored the heckler or waited for security to handle it with a polite smile. But Trump has always operated on the law of hit back 10 times harder. He turned his entire body toward the catwalk railing, looking directly down at Sabula, who was about 60 feet below and 30 feet away. The president's face underwent a visible transformation. The campaign smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine, focused irritation. He pointed a finger back at Sabula, not as a gesture of recognition, but as an accusation. He began to move his lips, speaking not to the executives beside him, but directly to the man shouting from the floor. "Shut up," he seemed to say at first, but as Sabula's shouts continued, the president's temper flared. He was framed by the massive Ford logo in the background, a composition that would soon become the most shared image in the world. He leaned over the railing, closing the distance as much as the Secret Service would allow, and engaged in a silent, high-stakes shouting match. Then came the moment that would define the week. Trump's hand came up, and with a deliberate, slow motion, he extended his middle finger toward the worker. It wasn't a quick flip of the bird, done in a moment of panic. It was a held gesture, a defiant New York salute, delivered with the weight of the presidency behind it. To seal the interaction, Trump's mouth formed two very clear, very unmistakable words. Without the need for a microphone, the labial F and the hard K of the expletive were visible to every camera lens in the room. He said it once, then repeated it, his eyes never leaving Sabula's until he was satisfied the message had been received. The reaction was instantaneous. A group of pro-Trump workers nearby began to cheer the president's defiance, laughing and clapping at the sight of the middle finger in chief. To them, this was the ultimate alpha move, a leader who wouldn't be bullied by a liberal plant or a disgruntled loser. The factory floor became a shouting match between two factions of the same workforce. The Secret Service reached Sabula within seconds. They didn't tackle him, but they formed a human wall around him, cutting off his view of the president. They began the process of escorting him from the floor, their hands firmly on his biceps. Sabula didn't struggle. He walked with his head high, a man who felt he had achieved exactly what he set out to do. Up on the catwalk, the tour resumed, but the energy had turned sour. The Ford executives tried to steer the conversation back to the torque of the electric motors, but the president was clearly distracted. He kept glancing back toward the section where Sabula had been standing, mulling over the interaction. He wasn't shaken. If anything, he looked energized by the combat. The press pool was in a state of controlled frenzy. Journalists were frantically checking their playbacks, zooming in on the president's mouth to confirm the expletive. "Did you get it? Tell me you got the finger," one photographer whispered to another. They knew they were no longer covering a factory tour. They were covering a cultural explosion. By the time the president reached the end of the line to give his formal remarks, the video was already being uploaded to servers in New York and DA. It didn't matter what he said about the economy or the F-150 anymore. The Rouge Rebellion had already gone global, and the image of the president's middle finger was about to become the new American Rorschach test. The speed of the internet in 2026 is a terrifying thing. Within 15 minutes of the gesture, the finger was the #1 trending topic on every major social media platform. On TikTok, Gen Z creators were already remixing the footage to heavy metal soundtracks. On X, formerly Twitter, the blue checks were locked in a war of words over presidential decorum versus authenticity. conservative influencers immediately pivoted to a defensive posture. They framed the gesture as a blue-collar salute to a deep-state agitator. They argued that after years of being insulted by the media and the elite, the president was simply speaking the language of the people. To them, the middle finger was a symbol of a man who wouldn't back down from a fight, no matter how small the opponent. On the other side, the condemnation was swift and searing. Critics argued that the office of the presidency had reached a new low. They pointed out that Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower would never have stooped to such a level, especially toward a tax-paying citizen in their own workplace. They called it unhinged, unpresidential, and a disgrace to the Ford Motor Company. The White House press shop, led by Stephen Chung, didn't wait for the news cycle to eat them alive. They issued a statement that was as combative as the gesture itself. The president was being heckled by a lunatic who was shouting deranged conspiracy theories, the statement read. His response was appropriate and what any red-blooded American would do when faced with such disrespect. As the motorcade left the Dearborn plant and headed toward the next event, the president was reportedly scrolling through the reactions on his phone. Far from being upset, he was said to be pleased with the toughness of the footage. He knew his base loved a fighter, and he had just given them a knockout blow captured in 4K resolution. Back at Ford World headquarters, the mood was anything but celebratory. The company's public relations team was in a full-blown code red. They had invited the president to showcase their technology and their commitment to American labor, but instead, their brand was now permanently linked to a viral moment of political profanity. Phone lines were jammed with calls from angry customers. Some were threatening to cancel their F-150 orders because the company allowed a worker to heckle the president. Others were threatening to boycott because the company allowed the president to insult a worker. It was the ultimate corporate nightmare, being caught in the crossfire of a culture war where there is no middle ground. Jim Farley and Bill Ford Jr. reportedly held an emergency meeting in the Glass House, the Ford HQ building. They had to decide how to handle T.J. Sabula. Under company policy, harassment or verbal abuse of guests was a fireable offense. However, firing him would turn him into a martyr for the anti-Trump movement. Keeping him would alienate the pro-Trump segment of their customer base. Ultimately, the decision was made to place Sabula on an indefinite administrative suspension, pending a full investigation. It was a half measure designed to buy time, but in the modern era, half measures satisfy no one. Within an hour of the suspension being leaked, Boycott Ford was trending from both the left and the right for entirely different reasons. The company released a sterile, carefully worded statement. Ford Motor Company is a place of work where we expect mutual respect from all parties. We are investigating the incident that occurred on the floor today. It was a dull shield against a sharp sword, and it did little to stop the bleeding of their stock price, which dipped 2% by the closing bell. While the lawyers and PR execs fretted, the real America was making its voice heard. In the dive bars of Dearborn and the coffee shops of Grand Rapids, the Michigan finger was the only topic of conversation. The event had touched a nerve that went far beyond the Jeffrey Epstein files or factory production. For many working-class Americans, there was a secret thrill in seeing the president act like one of them. "If some guy yelled at me at my job, I'd give him the finger too," said one local mechanic interviewed by the Nightly News. To this segment of the population, Trump's lack of decorum was his greatest strength. It proved he wasn't a polished liar like the rest of the politicians. But for others, the moment was a breaking point. Mothers in the suburbs, a key demographic for the upcoming elections, expressed a sense of exhaustion. "I'm trying to teach my kids not to use those words or those gestures," one woman told a reporter. "How am I supposed to explain that the President of the United States is doing it to a guy just trying to do his job?" The UAW, United Auto Workers, leadership found themselves in a bind. Their president, Shawn Fain, had to defend his member, Sabula, regardless of the politics. He issued a statement supporting the workers' right to free speech on the shop floor, especially when demanding government transparency. "A worker's voice doesn't belong to the company or the president," Fain declared. Meanwhile, the internet sleuths had found Sabula's social media. Within hours, his life was laid bare, his hobbies, his family, his past votes. He became a main character of the internet, a title that brings both immense support and terrifying harassment. He was receiving death threats and job offers in the same hour. That evening, President Trump appeared at the Detroit Economic Club. The room was filled with donors and local business leaders, but the air was still vibrating from the afternoon's confrontation. When he took the stage, he didn't apologize. He didn't pivot. He leaned into the controversy with a smirk that told the crowd he knew exactly what he had done. "We had a little excitement at the Ford plant today," he told the crowd, to a roar of laughter and applause. "Some guy, a real beauty, was shouting some very nasty things. Very nasty. And I told him, I said, we don't want to hear it. I gave him a little message from all of us." The crowd went wild, chanting his name. The president spent the next 20 minutes deconstructing the incident, turning Sabula into a symbol of the radical left, despite Sabula's claims of being a nonpartisan populist. He framed his middle finger as a defensive weapon used to protect the sanctity of the tour. In Trump's narrative, he was the victim of a rude worker, and his reaction was a service to the country. This is the core of the Trump era, the ability to turn a perceived gaffe into a rallying cry. By the end of the night, the Michigan finger was being printed on T-shirts that were already selling for $35 on his campaign website. The image was being used to raise millions of dollars in small dollar donations, proving once again that in American politics, outrage is the most valuable currency. Back in his hotel room, T.J. Sabula watched the footage of the president mocking him. He sat at his kitchen table with his wife, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had set out to ask a question about a conspiracy, and he had ended up becoming a part of the greatest political theater on earth. He realized then that his life would never be the same. By the following Monday, the dust had begun to settle, but the landscape had changed. The Ford plant incident was no longer just a news story, it was a cultural touchstone. It was the moment that defined the 2026 political climate, a world where the line between a factory floor and a boxing ring had completely vanished. T.J. Sabula's GoFundMe reached nearly $500,000. He decided to donate a large portion of it to victims of human trafficking, a move that slightly shifted the narrative back toward his original intent regarding the Epstein files. He remained on suspension, but he had become a hero to a very specific, very loud segment of the American public. Ford Motor Company eventually reinstated Sabula after a week of intense UAW negotiation, but they moved him to a different part of the plant to avoid further conflict. The company's internal memos emphasized neutrality, but the Rouge would always be remembered as the place where the president broke the fourth wall of politics. The incident forced a national conversation about the dignity of the office. Columns were written in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, debating whether the president had lowered the bar or simply met the people where they were. It was a debate with no winner, only a deeper understanding of how far apart the two Americas had drifted. In the end, the Michigan finger became a symbol of the age. It was a Tuesday at a Ford plant that started with a truck and ended with a middle finger. It was raw, it was ugly, it was authentic, and it was undeniably American. It was a moment that proved that in the heart of the Rust Belt, the loudest sound isn't the machines, it's the people.